December 6, 1914. The air is thick with tension on the Western Front. German soldiers are lined up in the trenches, peering over the top with a smirk. The P1914 is rolling into action for the first time, and the Germans are laughing. They scoff at it, dismissing it as yet another overhyped piece of machinery that will never live up to its promise. They've seen new technology come and go, and this one, they think, is no different. But what they don't know is that this laughable contraption is about to change everything. Picture this: it's 1914, and the Germans are sitting pretty, watching as the British and French scramble to figure out how to properly defend against their offensive. Enter the P1914, a new gun that the Allies developed. The Germans? Well, they laugh. They think it's too big, too unwieldy, and frankly, they don't believe it will do any real damage. But what they didn't realize was that this would soon become their worst nightmare. At first glance, the P1914 seemed like a cumbersome, oversized relic in comparison to the sleek and reliable German models. To the German High Command, the new gun appeared impractical, more of a theoretical experiment than a weapon that could change the course of the war. They saw it as a cumbersome piece of equipment, something too heavy to transport, too unwieldy to use in the fast-moving, fluid style of combat they envisioned. The P1914 was everything they didn't believe a gun should be. It was bulky, with a long barrel and a slow rate of fire, but it came with a devastating twist. It was incredibly accurate and powerful. Despite its awkward appearance, it was capable of laying down a barrage of fire that could stop entire waves of troops in their tracks. The Germans, used to their own superior weaponry, dismissed the P1914 as an unworthy adversary. They laughed at the British and French for thinking it could stand up to the might of their forces. The gun, in their eyes, was just another overly complicated attempt at war innovation that would quickly fall apart under the pressure of real combat. They had no idea how wrong they were. As the war continued, the P1914 proved itself in the most brutal of ways. The first signs of its true potential appeared when British and French forces began deploying it in key battles along the Western Front. The Germans, initially mocking the gun's design, were forced to reckon with its deadly effectiveness. The P1914, with its exceptional accuracy and stopping power, could decimate German infantry charges, mow down entire squads, and create chaos in the ranks of an advancing enemy. What had once been viewed as a laughable weapon soon became a tool of unimaginable terror. What the Germans had failed to understand was the true nature of the P1914's design. While they had expected an unreliable, oversized weapon that would be easily outmaneuvered, the Allies had designed it with a particular purpose in mind: to halt the German advances and keep them pinned down during critical moments. In the trenches, the P1914's precision fire was devastating. It could cut through enemy lines with lethal efficiency, rendering any enemy charge futile. Its ability to fire long bursts of ammunition with pinpoint accuracy transformed the tide of several engagements. As the war dragged on, the Germans found themselves increasingly plagued by this gun they had once mocked. What had been an underestimation of Allied ingenuity quickly turned into a strategic nightmare. Their once unstoppable advances were now frequently halted by the sound of the P1914's steady fire, and with it came the harsh realization they had underestimated the power of a weapon that would forever change the nature of warfare. The very thing they laughed at had now become one of their most feared enemies on the battlefield. Imagine living in a mud pit, covered in your own sweat and the stench of rotting bodies. Welcome to life in the trenches. The constant noise, shells exploding, soldiers yelling, the chatter of gunfire is relentless. The ground beneath you is a sticky, foul-smelling quagmire, and that's not even the worst part. The rats? They're the size of small cats, and they're as hungry as you are. It's like living in an ever-present nightmare, but without the ability to wake up. The trenches, designed to provide shelter from the enemy's fire, quickly became prisons of despair. The air, thick with the smell of decay, was almost unbearable. It wasn't just the dead soldiers that stank. The wet, mud-soaked earth itself reeked of rotting vegetation and stagnant water. Bodies, both human and animal, often lay scattered in the mud, forgotten by the chaos of battle. The soldiers would sometimes have to step over them, too exhausted or numb to feel the weight of what they had become accustomed to. The stench was so overwhelming that it seemed to seep into their very being, a constant reminder of their grim surroundings. For the men, the smell of death became indistinguishable from the smell of life. And then there was the noise, the cacophony that never ceased. Shells screamed through the air, their impacts shaking the ground and sending up splinters of wood and earth. The constant barrage was deafening, leaving no room for silence, no escape from the chaos. Between the explosions, there was the constant crackle of gunfire, the cries of wounded men, and the orders barked from officers trying to maintain some semblance of order. Amidst the madness, even sleep became impossible. The men lay in their filthy dugouts, eyes wide open, waiting for the next shell to fall. Sleep, when it came, was a restless, tormented thing, marked by nightmares that often seemed more real than waking life. The ground itself seemed to conspire against them. What should have been solid earth became an ever-changing nightmare. The rain, which fell in torrents, turned the trenches into thick, sticky mud that clung to every boot, making every movement a struggle. Soldiers would sink into the muck, their feet trapped by the weight of the wet earth, their boots caked in layers of mud that seemed to grow thicker with every passing day. It wasn't just the mud that made life in the trenches unbearable. It was the cold, the dampness that never seemed to leave, seeping into their bones, numbing them, both physically and mentally. But the worst part, perhaps, were the rats. These creatures, large and bold, became the true rulers of the trenches. They scurried through the muck, rummaging through the food rations, and gnawing on whatever scraps they could find. They were relentless, multiplying in the darkness, more than willing to feast on the dead or even the living if given the chance. The soldiers, already battling the harsh elements, often found themselves engaged in an ongoing war with the rats. The vermin, which seemed to thrive in the conditions of the trenches, were a constant source of dread and disgust. At night, the rats would come out in droves, their red eyes glowing in the dim light of the few candles or lanterns that were left burning. They would crawl over the soldiers, snatching what little food they had left, and sometimes even nibbling at their feet as they tried to sleep. For the men in the trenches, the physical and mental toll of war was compounded by the relentless horrors of trench life. They had become desensitized to the constant noise, the stench, the mud, and the rats, but each day left its mark. Their bodies were broken, their spirits shattered, and the world they once knew was distant, almost unrecognizable. But still, they endured. The will to survive, even in the face of such overwhelming suffering, kept them going. And for those who made it through, the memory of the trenches would stay with them forever, an indelible mark on their souls. It's April 1915. The Germans have just introduced something that would forever change the course of warfare: poison gas. You're in the trenches, trying to stay as low as possible, when suddenly the air around you thickens. It smells strange, sweet, almost sickly. And then the coughing starts. Soldiers fall, gasping for breath. The first gas attack is more than just a weapon. It's a psychological weapon that makes everyone question how much longer they can survive this hellhole. The soldiers, initially unaware of the danger, start to panic. Their first instinct is to pull off their masks, but it's already too late. The gas has seeped into their lungs, and with each breath, their bodies begin to fail. It's a slow and agonizing process, one that leaves them choking and writhing in the mud. What they had once believed to be a safe haven, their trenches, has now turned into a death trap. No longer are the men just facing bullets and artillery. They are now fighting against an invisible, insidious enemy. The gas moves through the air like a living thing, flowing over the soldiers like a tide, forcing them to breathe in the poison, to succumb to its suffocating grip. As the gas spreads, the men in the trenches scramble to cover their faces with whatever they can find. But nothing truly protects them from the effects of the poison. The gas doesn't just burn the throat and eyes, it attacks the lungs, filling them with fluid and making it nearly impossible to breathe. The men who survive the initial onslaught are left gasping, their breathing labored, their bodies weakened by the invisible attack. Many fall into a stupor, delirious from the lack of oxygen, while others writhe in pain, too disoriented to even move. The gas turns the battlefield into a nightmare, a place where death comes not from bullets or explosions, but from something as simple and essential as air. The psychological toll of the gas attack is as devastating as the physical one. The soldiers, who have already been subjected to the horrors of war, now face something they cannot fight. There is no cover from the gas, no way to avoid it. For the first time, they realize that survival in the trenches is no longer just about being brave or being quick. It's about avoiding something they can't see or control. The very air they breathe has become a weapon, and they are powerless against it. The fear that grips them is unlike anything they've experienced before. The psychological impact of gas warfare is profound, leaving men with a lingering sense of dread that will haunt them long after the attack ends. The gas attack, however, is not just a lesson in suffering, it is a turning point in the way warfare is fought. The Germans, having unleashed their new weapon, realize its effectiveness in creating chaos and confusion among the enemy. What had once been a battlefield filled with direct confrontations is now a place where fear and paranoia spread just as quickly as the gas itself. The soldiers, already on edge from the constant threat of death, now find themselves facing a new kind of warfare, one that attacks not only the body, but the mind as well. For the Allies, the first gas attack becomes a wake-up call, a moment of reckoning that forces them to adapt or face annihilation. Gas masks are quickly distributed, but they are no match for the psychological damage the attack has done. The landscape of war has changed forever, and with it, the understanding of what it means to survive. The trenches may have been a place of death, but after the gas attack, they become something far worse, a symbol of how the very environment of war can turn against you. The gas has entered the battlefield, and with it, a new kind of terror that no soldier, no matter how brave, can escape. It's July 1st, 1916. You're part of the British offensive at the Battle of the Somme. The plan is simple. The artillery will soften up the German lines, and then you and your comrades will advance and break through. But as you step out of the trench, you're greeted with a horrific reality. The shells didn't destroy the German defenses like they were supposed to. Instead, you're caught in open ground, under fire, with no cover in sight. Thousands of men fall, and the battle becomes a brutal lesson in overconfidence and poor planning. As the first wave of soldiers emerges from the relative safety of the trenches, the initial optimism of the offensive quickly turns into horror. The artillery barrage that had been meant to destroy the German barbed wire and bunkers falls short, leaving the defenders largely intact and able to retaliate with devastating accuracy. The British soldiers, many of whom are barely trained or equipped for the scale of battle they face, are now exposed to a hail of machine gun fire and artillery shells. There's no place to hide. The men who had marched out with optimism and determination are quickly turned into sitting targets. As the bodies of the fallen pile up, the survivors are forced to crawl over their comrades, trying to make their way forward but gaining no ground. The sound of the guns is deafening, an unrelenting roar that drowns out everything else. The earth shakes with each explosion, and the air is thick with the acrid smell of cordite and smoke. The sky, once clear, is now filled with the dark clouds of battle. Some soldiers are struck down instantly by artillery shells or machine gun fire, their lives snuffed out in an instant. Others lie wounded, calling for help that never comes. The initial confusion and panic set in as soldiers realize that the plan has failed, and the horror of being caught in open ground begins to sink in. The unspoken truth becomes clear. They are being slaughtered. For the men of the British offensive, there is no easy way out. Their commanders had promised that the artillery would clear a path, but instead, the bombardment has served only to expose the advancing troops to more devastating fire. The barbed wire that was supposed to be destroyed still stands in thick, tangled heaps, and the German machine gun nests remain untouched, firing relentlessly into the advancing ranks. The soldiers' heavy packs, cumbersome weapons, and the weight of their own exhaustion slow their progress, while the ground beneath them becomes soaked with blood. Many of them fall before they even get close to the enemy lines. The battle is meant to be a breakthrough, a decisive moment in the war, but it quickly turns into a massacre. The British advance slows to a crawl as the men are cut down in waves. The fog of war sets in, with no clear direction for most of the soldiers. Many don't even know where they are or what their mission is anymore. They are simply trying to stay alive, to survive the next minute. But despite the mounting casualties, they push forward, driven by duty, fear, and the desperate hope that something will change. The failure of the first day at the Battle of the Somme is one of the greatest lessons in the horrors of modern warfare. It reveals the dangers of overconfidence, the limitations of artillery, and the brutal reality of trench warfare. What was supposed to be a coordinated breakthrough becomes a brutal reminder of the cost of poor planning and the unfathomable sacrifice of the soldiers caught in its wake. Thousands of lives are lost, and the lessons of that day will haunt those who survive, as they realize the true price of war, one that no amount of strategy or preparation can ever truly prepare them for. The Germans had mocked the P1914, but soon enough they weren't laughing anymore. As the gun roared to life in the hands of the Allies, it cut through their ranks with terrifying precision. Men who had once sneered at the gun's design were now scrambling to realizing too late the damage it could do. The P1914 didn't just change the battlefield, it reshaped how both sides would fight for the rest of the war. Initially, the P1914 was dismissed by the Germans as an oversized, clunky weapon that had no place in modern warfare. They believed its bulk and weight made it impractical, and they saw no reason to worry about it. They were used to the more refined, faster-firing German machine guns, which had proven effective in earlier battles. To them, the P1914 was nothing more than an outdated design, a relic from a time before machine guns had evolved into sleek, efficient killing machines. They underestimated its potential, unaware that the Allies had recognized something the Germans had missed: the P1914's raw power. When the P1914 was finally deployed on the front lines, it quickly proved its worth. Its large frame, once seen as a hindrance, actually gave it a stability and accuracy that the lighter German guns could not match. The P1914 had a longer range, a heavier rate of fire, and perhaps most importantly, it was capable of laying down a sustained, unrelenting barrage of fire that could devastate enemy positions. The gun's powerful recoil was manageable for a well-trained crew, and its robust construction allowed it to survive the grueling conditions of trench warfare. It was a force multiplier capable of holding back waves of enemy soldiers with devastating efficiency. As the first 1914 roared into action, the Germans were caught off guard. The steady, relentless fire from the P1914 tore into their ranks, cutting down men who had thought themselves safe behind their entrenched positions. The sound of the gun was deafening, and its effectiveness on the battlefield was immediate. German soldiers, unprepared for such an assault, panicked. They were not accustomed to facing such a sustained barrage of firepower, and many of them froze in place, unable to react in time to the devastation unfolding before them. For the Germans, the realization came too late. They had underestimated the P1914, assuming it would be a failure based on its size and design. But the Allies had seen the potential of the machine, and they used it with deadly efficiency. The tide of the battle began to shift, as the Germans, once so confident in their superiority, found themselves on the defensive. The P1914, with its powerful, continuous stream of fire, began to break through the German defenses, forcing them to retreat or risk being annihilated. It fundamentally altered the way both sides approached combat. As the days passed, the P1914 became a symbol of the Allied resolve. The Germans, who had once mocked it, now understood its value all too well. Their own machine guns, though formidable, could not match the power and precision of the P1914. The introduction of this new weapon forced the Germans to adapt, to rethink their tactics, and to find new ways to counter the Allies' newfound advantage. It was a pivotal moment in the war, one that demonstrated the importance of innovation, strategy, and the willingness to embrace the power of new technology on the battlefield. The P1914 had not only turned the tide, it had ensured that the Allies would fight on with a new sense of strength and purpose. It's one of those things no one ever warns you about. Trench foot. You're stuck in the trenches for days, sometimes weeks, with your feet constantly submerged in cold, wet, muddy water. At first, your feet feel numb, but that soon gives way to pain. It burns, it aches, and then it starts to swell. And as the days pass, you start to see what you feared. The skin begins to rot. There's no cure, only temporary relief, and that's only if you're lucky enough to survive long enough for the doctor to treat you. In the trenches of World War I, the soldiers were often forced to live in conditions that made basic survival an endless struggle. The trenches, meant to protect soldiers from enemy fire, became places of filth, squalor, and unimaginable discomfort. Waterlogged, muddy, and frequently flooded, they were breeding grounds for disease and infections. But it wasn't just the rats or the constant shelling that threatened the soldiers. The most insidious threat, the one that would slowly cripple countless men, was the relentless, unseen killer: trench foot. At first, trench foot seems like an inconvenience. Soldiers, having spent hours or even days standing in freezing water and mud, would feel a slight discomfort in their feet. It would begin with numbness, a simple feeling that their feet had gone to sleep. But as time wore on, the pain would intensify. It's an agonizing, creeping sensation that starts from the toes and works its way up. The feet swell, the skin tightens, and the soldiers would find themselves unable to move without immense pain. What once seemed like minor discomfort became unbearable. But the soldiers had no choice but to push on. The root cause of trench foot was the combination of cold and damp conditions, along with the constant pressure of standing or walking in the same position for hours on end. The circulation in the feet would slow, and the blood would struggle to reach the extremities, causing the tissue to die. The soldiers often wore boots that were too tight or wet from standing in puddles and trenches, making the problem even worse. Their feet, perpetually submerged in the cold, would start to lose feeling, and the numbness would soon give way to a searing, excruciating pain. With each step, the infection would spread further into the skin. As the days passed, the foot would begin to turn a dark red or purple color, the skin becoming pale and swollen, with open sores appearing. The soldiers would be forced to endure, sometimes for weeks, unable to move or seek relief from the pain. Some soldiers were even forced to have their feet amputated as the infection spread further into the bones, making the foot completely useless. If untreated, trench foot could lead to gangrene and eventually death. But even when treated, there was often only temporary relief. The soldiers would return to the trenches only to be struck down again by the same killer. Trench foot wasn't just a physical ailment. It was a symbol of the horrors of trench warfare. It represented the slow, grinding nature of the war, where men were left to suffer in brutal conditions that seemed to have no end. It was a reminder of the relentless struggle for survival, not just against the enemy, but against the very environment they were forced to endure. The invention of trench foot, as it was later called, marked a new chapter in the suffering of soldiers during World War I. It was one of the many ways the war would break the spirit and bodies of those who fought, leaving them to face not only the enemy, but the hostile terrain they found themselves trapped in. You've survived another battle. The sound of gunfire and artillery has faded, and for a moment everything is eerily quiet. You sit down, exhausted, in the muddy trench. The silence is almost worse than the battle itself. In the calm, you're left with your thoughts, your fear, and your hunger. And when the next wave of fighting comes, you'll have to be ready again. Because in war, it's never over until it's over. During these lulls in combat, time seems to stretch endlessly. The constant barrage of noise that had defined the previous hours is gone, replaced by an oppressive silence that seems almost unnatural. The battlefield is a different place now, still, empty, and strangely haunting. It's a silence that's heavy with anticipation, as if everyone knows that the next attack could come at any moment. In these moments, the soldiers are left to confront the deeper, more personal aspects of war that they had been too busy to acknowledge during the chaos of combat. In the stillness, you can hear the smallest sounds, the scraping of a shovel in the mud, the shuffle of boots against the wet earth, the distant rumble of artillery far off in the horizon. The wind picks up, carrying with it the damp chill of the battlefield. And for a brief moment, the soldiers are given a fleeting taste of peace. But it is only a false peace, a brief respite before the next storm. The silence seems to magnify everything. The dull ache in your limbs, the emptiness of your stomach, the unshakable fear that never fully leaves you. The longer the silence lasts, the more oppressive it becomes. It's not just the fear of the next battle, but the crushing realization that this quiet might be the calm before an even greater storm. There's no comfort in the stillness, no joy in the pause. The soldiers, surrounded by mud, rats, and the stench of death, find that the quiet often leaves them more vulnerable than the noise of battle. In the heat of combat, there's at least a purpose, a reason to keep moving, to fight back. But in the lull, everything feels aimless. The soldiers are left to contend with their exhaustion, their hunger, and the ever-present question of whether they will live to see another day. The fear, which had been kept at bay by the constant rush of action, begins to creep back in, slowly at first, then more insidiously, until it dominates their every thought. The physical toll is just as relentless. Even in these moments of quiet, there is no true rest. The mud continues to cling to their boots, the dampness sinks into their bones, and the constant threat of disease hangs over them like a shadow. Sleep is nearly impossible in these conditions, and when sleep does come, it's shallow and fragmented, plagued by nightmares of the battle they've just survived and the one they know is coming. There is no escape from the mental and physical strain of war. The lull might offer brief respite, but it never offers peace. And yet, somehow, the soldiers endure. They talk in hushed voices about their homes, their families, the world they left behind, anything to distract themselves from the crushing weight of the moment. But the distractions are fleeting, and the reality always returns. The silence is temporary, and the next wave of fighting is just a matter of time. For the soldiers, this quiet is both a gift and a curse. It is a chance to breathe, to collect themselves, but it also serves as a reminder that in war, the only certainty is the next battle. The silence may feel like an end, but in truth, it is only the calm before the storm. In the trenches, the officers were often just as vulnerable as the enlisted men. But there was something else, something more sinister. Officers were seen as the source of the endless attacks, the ones who ordered men to march into certain death. And in those dark moments, with the fighting at its worst, the men began to resent them. As the bullets whizzed by and the artillery shelled their positions, many officers found themselves marked targets of their own men's frustration and anger. The trench warfare of World War I was a brutal, grinding conflict that wore down the soldiers on both sides. Days and weeks spent in the muck and mire of the trenches, under constant bombardment and facing the constant threat of death, began to erode the camaraderie that had once existed between officers and their men. The officers, who were often far removed from the horrors of the front lines, gave orders from the rear, sometimes without truly understanding the conditions their soldiers were enduring. Meanwhile, the enlisted men, fighting in the trenches, became increasingly disillusioned with the officers who seemed detached from the reality of the battlefield. The officers, seen as the architects of their misery, were blamed for the endless waves of assaults, the futile charges that cost so many lives, and the seeming disregard for the lives of the men they commanded. The officers, while still in danger, were often better equipped and better protected than the men in the trenches. They had access to more resources, better food, and were able to leave the front lines more frequently. This disparity in living conditions, coupled with their role in issuing orders that led to high casualties, created a deep resentment among the soldiers. The officers, in many ways, were seen as the symbol of the suffering endured by the men in the trenches. Their decisions often seemed arbitrary and out of touch with the realities of trench warfare, leading to growing anger among the ranks. As the war dragged on, this resentment grew. Soldiers, pushed to their physical and emotional limits, began to view their officers not as leaders, but as enemies. In the fog of war, with emotions running high, some soldiers began to question why they were willing to die for orders that often seemed pointless or even suicidal. The officers, who were meant to lead by example, were sometimes seen as having little understanding of the true nature of the fight. And that feeling of betrayal took root. In the eyes of many soldiers, officers were the ones who sent them into impossible situations without regard for their lives. This anger and resentment, coupled with the constant pressure of war, led to incidents where officers were targeted by their own men. Whether it was a deliberate act of defiance, a moment of intense frustration, or an emotional breakdown, soldiers sometimes acted on their feelings of betrayal. In some cases, officers were left isolated, targeted by their own soldiers who felt they had been abandoned to die for no reason. These acts of betrayal, though rare, reflected the deep psychological toll that the war had on both the enlisted men and their officers. It was a stark reminder that in the horrors of trench warfare, the lines between authority and empathy could become dangerously blurred. The targeting of officers by their own men is a tragic reflection of the dehumanizing effects of war. The relationship between officers and soldiers, once built on respect and camaraderie, had been torn apart by the brutal realities of trench warfare. Officers, once viewed as leaders to be followed, became symbols of frustration, anger, and betrayal. For many soldiers, the greatest threat wasn't always the enemy across the lines, but the men who were supposed to lead them into battle. The betrayal was not just a physical act, but a deep psychological wound that underscored the collapse of morale and trust on both sides. there's something even more extraordinary happening. The dead men, the soldiers who were believed to be dead after the gas attack, are rising again. Their skin is burned, their eyes bloodshot, but they're charging. They're charging into the German positions, defying all odds. It's as if the gas that nearly killed them has given them a new purpose: to survive no matter the cost. The gas attack had taken its toll. Men had fallen by the hundreds, their bodies writhing in agony as they suffocated on the poison that filled the trenches. The stench of death lingered in the air, thick with the sickly sweetness of the gas. It was supposed to have been the end of the Russian defenders, the thing that would break their spirit and force them to retreat. But as the gas lifted and the haze began to settle, something unimaginable happened. The dead, those who had been struck down by the poison, started to stir. At first, it was a few, their bodies twitching as they tried to rise, unsure of whether they were still alive or merely a shadow of what they had been. But then more followed. Their faces, swollen and disfigured, eyes glazed over with the remnants of the poison, seemed like ghosts returning from the grave. But they were far from ghosts. They were living men, driven by an unyielding will to fight, to continue the battle that had already claimed so many of their comrades. With every step, their bodies seemed to groan in protest. Their clothes were tattered, stained with mud, blood, and the remnants of poison gas. They staggered, barely able to hold their rifles. But they moved forward. The German forces, who had expected victory after the poison gas attack, now watched in horror as these men, these walking dead, came toward them. At first, the Germans thought it was a hallucination, the product of their own exhaustion and fear. But as the figures drew closer, it became clear. These men, who had been left for dead, were charging toward them with an intensity that defied logic. It wasn't just the madness of the moment, it was the desperation of survival. These soldiers, having tasted death and survived the horrors of gas, now fought with everything they had left. Their bodies were breaking down, their minds clouded by the trauma of the attack, but they were fueled by something deeper, a raw, primal instinct to keep fighting. The Germans, caught off guard, began to retreat, unsure of how to fight this new, terrifying force. The P1914, which had been so effective in tearing through ranks of soldiers, now found themselves overwhelmed by an unrelenting, almost supernatural charge. These men were no longer human in the way the Germans understood. They were the living embodiment of the horrors of war, rising from the ashes, unwilling to let death claim them. The charge was more than just a final push, it was a statement. It was the last act of defiance from men who had seen the worst that war could offer and refused to let it break them. Their bodies may have been broken, their spirits tested to the limit, but they fought not just for survival, but for the honor of those who had already fallen. As the German lines began to falter, the Russian survivors pushed forward, inch by inch, until they reached the enemy positions. There, with a final, desperate push, they overwhelmed the Germans, proving that even in the face of death, the human spirit could rise and fight. The dead men's charge became a symbol of the enduring will to survive, a testament to the idea that even when everything seems lost, there is always the possibility of defiance, of standing tall against the tide. It was a moment that would be remembered not for the brutality of the battle, but for the unshakable resolve of those who had been written off as lost, only to rise again and claim victory. By the end of the war, the P1914 had earned its place in history, but it wasn't just the gun that left its mark, it was the men who wielded it. They faced unimaginable horrors, and yet they survived. They became the symbols of resilience and strength. As the war ended, many returned home, but some never truly left the battlefield. The P1914 had changed them forever, and as the world moved on, their stories of survival, sacrifice, and the laughter that came before the storm would remain etched in time. The P1914 was more than just a weapon. It was a companion, a tool of survival for the soldiers who manned it. It roared to life on the battlefield, a relentless force that kept enemies at bay. But it was the soldiers who were its true legacy. They were the ones who knew the full weight of its power, who lived through the deafening sound of its fire, and who saw its devastating effects on the enemy. For them, the P1914 was a symbol of both destruction and survival. It had saved their lives in countless engagements, but it had also taken a toll on their souls. It was a constant reminder of the horrors they had endured, of the men they had lost, and of the world they would never return to. As the war drew to a close, many of these soldiers found themselves returning home, their bodies broken, their minds scarred. They came back to a world that had changed, a world that seemed distant and unfamiliar after the brutality of trench warfare. But the war was never truly over for them. The P1914 had become a part of their identity, a mark that could never be erased. They had fought with it, bled with it, and survived with it. And now, as they tried to reintegrate into civilian life, they carried the weight of the battlefield with them. Some of these men tried to return to the quiet life they had once known, returning to farms, factories, and homes. They tried to rebuild their lives, to find peace in the post-war world. But the memories lingered, the laughter they had shared with their comrades, the camaraderie they had built in the trenches, now felt distant and out of place in the civilian world. The P1914, in all its destructive power, had left a deeper scar than any physical wound. The psychological toll of war, of witnessing death, of fighting in the mud and poison, of the constant fear and suffering, had changed them forever. Many soldiers found themselves haunted by nightmares, by flashes of the battlefield that would never truly fade. The sounds of the P1914, its relentless fire, its cries of victory, were now etched into their minds. And as they tried to build new lives, they realized that the war would never leave them. The men who had fought alongside the P1914 became living legends. But their stories were not just of triumph. They were of sacrifice, of survival, and of the unspoken pain that followed them long after the guns fell silent. In time, the P1914 would be replaced by newer, more advanced weapons, but the legacy of the men who fought with it would endure. Their stories would be told in hushed tones, passed down through generations, a reminder of the brutal cost of war and the strength of the human spirit. The P1914, it was a testament to the men who carried it, to the resilience they showed, and to the sacrifices they made. Their legacy, like the gun itself, would never be forgotten.